A moment in history, the atomic bombings. On August 6, 1945, the world changed forever. This date marked a pivotal moment in human history, one that would alter the course of warfare and international relations for decades to come. The United States, embroiled in the final stages of World War II, dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. This act was not just a military strategy, but a demonstration of unprecedented destructive power. The devastation was immediate and unimaginable. Buildings were flattened, fires raged uncontrollably, and countless lives were lost in an instant. The city was reduced to rubble and the human toll was staggering. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, further solidifying the destructive power of this new weapon. The impact was equally catastrophic, leaving the city in ruins and its people in despair. The bombings effectively brought World War II to an end. Japan surrendered shortly after, marking the conclusion of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. However, they also ushered in the atomic age, casting a long shadow over humanity's future. The world now had to grapple with the reality of nuclear weapons and the potential for unprecedented destruction. The decision to use atomic bombs on Japan remains one of the most controversial in human history. It sparked intense debates about the ethics and necessity of such an action. It was a decision made in the crucible of war, where moral clarity is often obscured by the fog of conflict. Leaders faced immense pressure to end the war swiftly and decisively. To understand why the United States chose to unleash such a devastating force, we must delve into the complex historical context of the time. The decision was influenced by a myriad of factors, including military strategy, political considerations, and the desire to avoid further loss of life in a prolonged conflict. By 1945, World War II had ravaged the globe for 6 long years. Millions lay dead, victims of a conflict that had engulfed entire continents. The United States, deeply invested in the fight against the Axis powers, was grappling with the mounting costs of a protracted war. Public sentiment longed for a swift resolution, a return to peace and normalcy. Against this backdrop, the development of the atomic bomb presented a tantalizing prospect, a swift and decisive end to the bloodshed. Proponents of its use argued that it would save countless American lives that would be lost in a conventional invasion of Japan. They believed it was a necessary evil to bring the war to a swift conclusion. Beyond the immediate goal of ending the war, the United States was acutely aware of the shifting geopolitical landscape. The end of World War II was not just a conclusion, but a prelude to a new era of global power dynamics. American leaders were already looking ahead, strategizing for a world where alliances and rivalries would be redefined. The Soviet Union, a wartime ally, was emerging as a formidable power in its own right. Its military successes and rapid advancements were impossible to ignore. The Red Army's victories on the Eastern Front had not only turned the tide of the war, but also showcased the Soviet Union's growing military prowess. Concerns were growing about the Soviet Union's ambitions in Asia, particularly its interest in expanding its sphere of influence into territories held by Japan. The potential for Soviet dominance in Asia was a significant worry for American policymakers, who feared a new balance of power that could threaten Western interests. The atomic bombings in this context can also be viewed as a strategic maneuver aimed at limiting Soviet expansionism. By demonstrating the devastating power of nuclear weapons, the United States sought to deter Soviet advances and assert its own dominance. The bombings were a clear signal that the U.S. possessed unparalleled military capabilities. The display of overwhelming military power was intended to send a clear message. The United States was now the dominant force on the world stage. This show of strength was not just for Japan, but for the entire world to witness. It was a declaration of a new era where the U.S. would play a leading role in global affairs. The bombings were not just about ending a war, they were about shaping the post-war world order. The decisions made in those final days of the war were pivotal in setting the stage for the Cold War and the geopolitical tensions that would define the latter half of the 20th century. The shadow of Soviet influence loomed large, and the United States was determined to counter it at every turn. Section 4. Japan's unwavering resolve. To fully comprehend the rationale behind the bombings, it is crucial to understand Japan's wartime stance. Despite facing overwhelming odds and mounting losses, Japan had shown a steadfast refusal to surrender unconditionally. The Japanese military code of honor, imbued with a deep sense of nationalism and loyalty to the emperor, made surrender unthinkable. This unwavering resolve fueled the belief among some American military planners that only a demonstration of overwhelming force would compel Japan to capitulate. Conventional bombing raids, while devastating, had not broken the Japanese spirit. The atomic bombs, it was believed, would deliver the decisive blow. Section 5. Projecting power on the world stage. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not isolated events. They were part of a larger narrative of American power projection on the world stage. The United States, having emerged from World War II as a global superpower, was eager to assert its dominance and shape the post-war order. The atomic bombs, with their unparalleled destructive capabilities, became a chilling symbol of American might. They served as a stark warning to any potential adversaries, particularly the Soviet Union, of the consequences of challenging American supremacy. Section 6. The price of vengeance. The decision to use atomic bombs cannot be divorced from the emotional climate of the time. The attack on Pearl Harbor, which had plunged the United States into war, still loomed large in the American psyche. The memory of that day, of the lives lost and the feeling of vulnerability, fueled a desire for retribution. While strategic considerations played a significant role in the decision-making process, it is undeniable that the bombings also served as an act of vengeance. They were a way to inflict punishment on Japan for its aggression and to assuage, to some extent, the pain and anger felt by the American people. Section 7. Averting further atrocities. Proponents of the bombings also argued that they ultimately saved lives, both American and Japanese. They believed that the immediate and overwhelming devastation caused by the atomic bombs forced Japan to surrender, thus avoiding a prolonged conflict. They pointed to the potential for catastrophic casualties on both sides if the United States had been forced to launch a full-scale invasion of Japan. Military experts estimated that such an invasion could have resulted in hundreds of thousands of American casualties and even more Japanese deaths. They argued that the bombs, however horrific, were a necessary evil to prevent a protracted and even bloodier conflict. The sheer destructive power of the atomic bombs was seen as a means to shock Japan into surrendering, thereby averting further loss of life on a massive scale. Furthermore, they contended that the bombings served to prevent further Japanese atrocities. Throughout the war, Japan had demonstrated a brutal disregard for human life, particularly in its treatment of prisoners of war and conquered populations. The Japanese military's actions in occupied territories were marked by extreme violence and cruelty. The bombings, proponents argued, brought an end to these horrific acts by compelling Japan to surrender unconditionally. The atomic bombs, in this view, brought a swift end to the suffering and saved countless lives that would have been lost had the war continued. By forcing Japan's surrender, the bombings not only ended the war, but also prevented further atrocities and human suffering on an unimaginable scale.